welcome to our next webinar in our APICS Navigating Through Volatility webinar series. We're excited to have a webinar focused on distribution as our next webinar. And this, I'm Lisa Anderson. I'm the president of APICS Inland Empire, and I'm also president of LMA Consulting Group, which is sponsor of this webinar series. And so I'm excited to turn it over to Frank Moullet. Frank is, okay, oh dear, hold on one moment. Frank is a branch operations manager at Shamrock Foods in Ontario, California. He has strategic and daily accountability for all operations within the 450,000 square foot food service distribution facility, shipping 430,000 plus cases weekly. Wow. Prior to Shamrock Foods, Frank had an in-depth career in warehousing and distribution operations at MBM Corporation, Maine's Paper and Food Service, and Shamrock Foods. He's been actively involved in advancing productivity and service with the use of technology and in sharing expertise with community leaders and trade associations. And Frank has provided a tour for us in the past, which was, really popular. So hopefully COVID passes and we can come back. So I know that we had some requests to do that. We're all hoping COVID passes for many reasons. Yeah. And that'll be one of the topics today is how are you coping with COVID? So with that said, though, I'll turn it over to Frank. And as we do that, please go ahead and submit questions to the chat box or to the Q&A, and I will ask them of Frank as we go, and as we wrap up. He likes to make things interactive, so we'd love to answer your distribution and technology questions today. So with that said, Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. And before we started, folks, just kind of what is our objective here today, and who is this guy? So as Lisa mentioned, I have been in the distribution business for 12 years now going on. So, after this COVID and we're coming out of this, your memory gets a little bit shaken because you've had to be tugged and pulled in so many directions, and being nimble is key to surviving currently, because the objective and the perceived desired outcome constantly is changing as the environments and variables change. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about here today. And so I want to just put out there that I am by no means the expert on all-in distribution. I do find myself to be a good resource and a very passionate person who can sometimes talk too much. So I'm going to try and refrain from the extra wordiness today, but I say this because I really enjoy the collaborative piece of presenting, and I enjoy the discussion and kind of going with the direction that the recipients want to see and feel. So as Lisa mentioned, please feel free if you have questions or thoughts. You have the light bulb or the bubble up moment. We love that. I love that, and we're flexible and nimble, just like we have to be. So.
Right. Right. And no one is a complete expert on all things supply chain, or you would have to be like 800 years old and who knows what.
I learn every day, I find myself, right? So when I thought I knew it all, out comes something I never have seen before. Yep. So, all right, well, what are we talking about today? Being an operations manager and being 100% operations driven in my everyday life and in my passion. I love process. I love structured environments, but I also love the ability to change the environments, because I believe change is not, it's more than a fundamental. It's just an absolute requirement, right, to survive in the modern world. And organizations that don't adapt and change to their changing environment, their changing market base, and their associates, right, the change in value proposition, at some point, in my opinion, can be doomed to a certain outcome, right, a less desirable outcome, because the world changes. However, change management is sometimes a difficult process. And so here we are, right, in a world that changes that fast. And I'm being told in real time from associates as I'm walking across the floor to look at something, did you hear? And it's a ground-shattering change for the structure we have. And no, thanks, you're the first one to tell me that's how fast the news is coming through. We've all experienced that, right? So it's nothing unfamiliar, but I want to give my personal operational tactics that I feel have been valuable, or lessons that I've learned, and we've developed that into a necessity, right, to persevere in a volatile world. So I love this topic, and happy to share some thoughts with you. So we get a little bit of the background, just a little bit more on that background piece. As we talked about experience in industry, really to get to an operations management role, or what would be considered in every other comparable competitor, if you will, it would be the VP of operations for the facility. At my point in career, you have to, one, be passionate. You have to be sometimes a little bit ridiculously committed, right? Folks go, I mean, really, you know, that's no. Look, I'm committed to the outcome. I'm committed to the team. Just as I give 110% in my personal, I do the same in professional. So it's a little crazy, but you also have to have a depth of experience. You can't always get that. You know, that much experience in a short period of time is 10 years, right? But the reason I think I've accumulated that, or I've seen that, has helped me move, and the reason I think this is a validation for the topic we're discussing, is my background is 100% in turnarounds, new organization rollouts, structure change. So I didn't start in SoCal. If you can hear the O or the no, I'm from Wisconsin, the Midwest, and so why are we going through this? Because getting through this environment, I felt like we had an organization here. We had structured it in a way that we knew what to do when things change, because coming into here was a change, right? And the 6 other distribution facilities from Massachusetts now to California and everywhere in between have all been changed. It's changing environment, changing groups, changing, you know, constantly reevaluating and reaffirming your efficacy, right? So this was actually a good, for me, a pressure test, and not so much an immovable object. But so that we're going to talk a little bit about that, and that's why I wanted to give the background and kind of the overview of where we're going. And so the next, real quick, is a strategic alignment. So I want to make sure everybody's bought in, or hopefully bought into, what the premise is to survive in a volatile operating environment. And then some key principles, and you can see those up here: adapting to our environment, flexibility in a rigid framework. I try to be a little bit kitschy with these because I think it's fun, right? But flexibility in a rigid environment, that's distribution, right? Everything we do in distribution is about repetition, 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 and structure. It's finding items, thousands of items in a giant facility, and we know where everything is because we have that rigid framework. But everything else is also rigid to survive in that. And this environment now is about change and constant change. So how do we survive in that evolving environment? And then just a brief wrap up. Am I going too fast, too slow? Lisa, how am I doing?
You're doing great. So keep going.
All right. So what is our strategy, right? So this is kind of the question, the fundamental question here we had to understand as we were moving through the different phases of COVID-19 and really the changing environment, because this is very much applicable to the current environment, but a lot of the fundamental principles you will see throughout business, right? As business needs change, it's just not as rapid or as intense, if you will, as what the COVID-19 environment has required to be sustainable and effective. So from this question, what is our strategy, comes our need to strategically align. And I think most everybody has experienced this. And if you haven't, it's probably because you're a grocery distributor. If you're in this line of supply chain, you're a grocery distributor, or you're something with basic consumer essential services. When you become commercial, industrial, enterprise, now that's changed really. Our network has changed, our usage. So what has happened then is, as the changes happen, restaurants aren't open, and the institutions are limiting service. We supply fire camps, we supply prisons, hospitals, colleges, huge event centers. All of that market has dried up. Now, thank gosh, we have diversification, because that's one segment of the business called broadline, but the other segment is contract chain. And so one side is literally just falling out, and the other side is drive-throughs. and large chain customers, right? And their business is booming because the one consistent thing we found with that business is it's maybe a little bit less desirable in terms of profitability or effect, right? Positive effect on the P&L, but it is a great cover for fixed, and it also helps us in times like these sustain. But because of that, right, the reason I go through that is our vision still viable? So at Shamrock Foods, I really try not to, assert all of this from the basis of Shamrock. They are a great employer, and I love the company I work for. I really, truly mean that. But, I'm speaking here on my background, but the vision, right, plays into the hear this. So is our vision still viable? We want to be, as part of our vision, right, a premier, right, service provider in the West for food service distribution. So somewhat has changed, right, because food service distribution, the market has changed. We talk about a premier provider or a top provider, and really now is it more about we want to sustain our ability to provide, right? So, I mean, what has changed fundamentally, and sometimes it might just be if your business was a specialty provider to high-end restaurants or anything along that line, and I'm sure each one of you can kind of determine what that is that still viable? Because what we found is in our organizational structure, and this also plays into your vision statement, so over-specialization can be dangerous in a volatile market. So we have to react to the markets changing. And so we have to understand what's now changed in our value proposition. And if our vision is no longer viable, what do we have to do differently, right? Because we can't determine the long-term outlook, right? So it's impossible right now. What we know is there will likely be some more effect, and COVID's not going away anytime soon. And what we fear even, and I'm not one who always buys into the popular media impression, but I do my research. I'm a biologist actually by background. I'm a biochemist by degree. So this is a little bit fascinating on this end too. But nature evolves, nature changes, and viruses are constantly known to mutate, right, and change in structure and effect. So we're not certain what long-term is. So how do we make certain we can stay viable? And because of that change in vision, obviously it has a trickle-down effect to mission and redefining our strategic goals. And to achieve those goals, we then have to change our tactics. And that's what the point of the meeting is how do we tactically survive through this changing environment? All right. So understanding, excuse me, a little flying here, understanding the changing environment. Our tactical capabilities here at Shamrock came out of necessity, and I think necessity kind of is the driver of a lot of the mission or the objective at this point in time we've all find ourselves in, right? So we need to survive. We need to be long-term viable. So we can hopefully outlast this outside influence of the virus and how it's changed our capabilities or our original vision, hopefully temporary. And so to do that, how do we stay viable? Well, this industry is inherently burdened by fixed costs, right? So our sense of survivability is how do we sustain our operating costs that cannot flex, because a lot of our business can flex. But a lot of our industry or part of our business is affected by huge occupancy costs, huge equipment and structural costs that we, like everyone else, don't have an outlet for easily or realistically when huge downturns come. And so you've got to find the cash flow and the means to overcome that, or you've got huge burdens on the post-COVID times, right? So a broader view in the food service distribution market, again, is kind of that business tactic. So we have the systems market, and that is our chain and concept. But our other business unit, where really the meat and potatoes is the broadline side, similar to the Cisco or US food service, is gone. We've now at the height or the heat, have lost, I believe, 60% of that customer base, and I hit a low point of almost 70%. Right?
Wow,
so
that's a lot.
Huge effect, right? And because of that, some changes were needed, right? So we all understand what many folks went through, we had to lay off a number of folks that were in more of a salary or administrative role. And then we did furloughs here for a lot of our associates because we needed to flex down that variable piece as much as we could. But there's a risk in that because you don't know when it's going to come back. Initially, was it going to, we thought short-lived, long-lived. So how do we stay ready? Because just as much as our assets as our buildings, without full automation, and even the highly automated distributors, right? Key integral pieces of their organization are rely on human capital, and we understand that there's an excess, right, of folks out there wanting to work right now, and that's sad to see after where we were pre-COVID. But if you're like us, there's a little bit of training, right, safety-wise, equipment-wise, and metric-wise that we have to put in. So we can't just grab folks and throw them into it. We want to retain our people. We need that human capital. And so what else can we do, right? What can we do during this time in our broader sense of background in warehousing and logistics to survive in this changing environment? Because when half of our business is dropped 70% and the other half did wane for a little bit, people didn't even leave, right? They burdened the grocery stores chains heavily to the point of huge outs. Where's my toilet paper? I can't find it, right, Lisa? I know you talked on that. And
You're
so
right.
even the fast food chains, they weren't eating for a while until everybody got cabin fever, right? And spending that much time with your kids or your significant other, I kind of expected that would change. It couldn't last forever. And that's not, we don't love them, but people need their space and need that ability to get out. So they still weren't going to go to white tablecloth, but they were going to go to those chains. So huge dips and dives. And when it relies on human capital and huge asset costs, you have to flex that business or you have to find out what else can we do. And sometimes along that way you learn we really shouldn't do that. So, I may have jumped ahead a little bit here, but flexibility in a rigid framework. So when I got in this business first, a lot of folks were like, understand the process, stick to the process, don't vary from the process. It's just repetition. It's boxes in, boxes out. And that's all traditional styles of thinking. And it's valid. But again, that need to be flexible or evolve with the market really has evolved as technology has evolved, right, in a business where it was traditionally always done the same way because that was the only means. Now we have automation and we have different methods to produce the wanted outcome. So, either you have to adapt to that or maybe you've come in from that tipping point where that's what is changing, right? And so our capabilities and what we could do, how can we overcome this and survive this trying time, is a short-term problem, but is it really a long-term obstacle, or what does the market look like when we came out? So we had to, again, kind of look at what are we specialized in? Can we adapt that? And what can we just do generally in supply chain and logistics? And the reason I looked at that, or I bring that up, is what we did, and Lisa, you and I talked a little bit on this, was unconventional. We started helping, not really competition, but we started helping the grocery chains. So we had resources, we had assets, we have refrigerated trailers. We manage our own private fleet of 140 trucks and trailers just within the SoCal market. It's growing continuously. We have 14 more on the way. We already purchased, and nobody wanted to give your money back after the environment dropped because everybody has a piece they can't get out of. And our company value statement is treat your customers and vendors like friends and your associates like family, right? And that's our culture here. And that's what makes it a great place to work for. But in that culture, you never want to waver. That should never change, right? That's what makes you different than everyone else to achieve your vision. And so we paid all of our bills on time, 100%. We bought from vendors and suppliers, and we couldn't stop things that were on the road. And it came in, and we did take some loss in dumping inventory, but we had to. It was that need, and this is what I've perceived, needs to be done in this business as big outlets are closing because they're so entrenched or ingrained in what they do, and they can change maybe their service platform a bit, but they can't change their operating structure. We're seeing very large businesses throw up the warning flag now, and I don't know, in my own personal opinion, how much leverage or support ability the government's going to have when everybody needs it at the same time. If you can't adapt, right? So that brought us to what are our current limitations? Because once we got the call, basically we said to some grocery chains and folks we knew from the supply chain environment, hey, we got a ton of produce. Does anybody need produce? Because this stuff is going out and we have no outlet for it. We didn't know how long it lasts, but we knew we only had maybe 5 to 8 days on the produce. And as the time passed, we're in this 3 to 4 day range, and we're seeing the grocery store struggling, and we're going, I've got truckloads, I've got mountains of produce, and I'm happy to send it your way. And so, those different supply chain leads into the businesses that were booming, they couldn't handle that. They didn't have the infrastructure, didn't have the capabilities. So not only did we divert our supply over in our relationships to that group, we also started looking at ways we can use our resources that are unutilized, both in the warehouse and possibly on the transportation side. And that came to the realization of what else can we do? Because this helped a small portion in the start, that fresh produce, those things that were missing from shelves. We were all struggling to find toilet paper. I didn't have the answer to that, until we got further along. The question was, I don't know, but if you find a bunch of it, please let me know, because it's selling like hotcakes. So we had to look at what else can we do, but that was constrained again by our rigid framework. And some of that is a limiting factor, at least temporarily. And some of that was something we can work past, right? It's hard to turn an aircraft carrier, and now we're being asked to flex it on a dime. And the perception of change management and the structure needed was quickly changed, and the associates and the operation understood that, but we had some things we couldn't compromise on. You can never compromise on safety. And now we have a health factor that if we have this impact on our business and we don't have the human capital in excess, we are going to be closed indefinitely. That is something without prevention, we know will derail our organization. So, part of this discussion is, what did we have to do? Always remember safety. We're not going to ask folks to support a new business line if our equipment, technology, and practices can't safely fit in that. We can modify or not utilize portions of our equipment or technology to achieve the objective, but we never compromise on safety. And so that has to be the same approach with health. And that's what we did immediately here. And I want to share this point because I think it talks to what needs to be done, because this is going to only continue to grow, and we're seeing regression, right? So now we've got to kind of look at what did we do to survive now, what can we do now? And so health came first before everything. It was a cost to change regular sanitation loops to hourly sanitizing and sterilizing, that's the word I'm looking for, right? So we had now decided, look, every touch point's a danger at first. We don't know exactly. There was a lot of uncertainty. Now we know some of the certain points and ways, right? So it should be a lot more effective if we have a round 2. When we have a round 2, I will add. But constant sanitizing. And there's a little bit of, when you understand the biology of that, there's a little bit of reasonability. And so if you're going to sanitize a surface, right, you have to leave it on for so long. You have to have a certain mixture ratio. And sanitizing wipes are really about perception or feel rate than they are about, being an effective sanitizer, because most folks might wipe that quick or dry that off. And how long those are viable is also, out there and not known by the general public. So understanding that my approach was, hey, first of all, let's secure some bleach, because we know that is, at the end of the day, that's the one viable thing you can always use. And that may dry up fast, just like toilet paper. We here went through, this is happening with toilet paper. What are the other key essentials? Tried to bring them in, rush them in. And then from our operations standpoint, sales didn't love it, but I have to stay viable or the whole organization collapse. We are the back end. We are the essential part of our organization, because without operations, the product we're producing doesn't exist, right? So we can have the best product, the most adaptable product, but without our team and our ability to ship in and out, nothing's going to happen. So I went in and allocated resources. So for health, we took pallets of bleach and hand sanitizing That was really not popular. So all the key essentials to keep your business running when those supplies for health and cleanliness are being dried up. And we locked them. We took them out, and we even went as far as to hide them, right? Because they even became the valuable concern, right, in walking off or someone else quick running in and grabbing. And so, those are the immediate pieces, sanitized, but all the same thing. Social distancing, we reduced chairs, we reduced break room tables. We really split that apart. We've required masks since day one, and we've never let down on that. So I cannot wear this mask when I'm in my office, but as soon as somebody walks in or you're anywhere on the property, a mask is required, even when they were backed off. Now I understand, the governor's reinstated that, but we never stopped because anything we can do is really just an added benefit. It's not if it's required or not. It's what we must do to protect our associates and also by that protect our business, right? And they rely on us, and they really realize that during these times. They're relying on us to stay safe and to keep their family provided, right? And so their buy-in is there. You just have to be unwavering in what those requirements are. And so now it's health checks and temperature screenings. All of that is a requirement, and there's no flexibility or exception. If an outside carrier comes on the lot, we do have paper face masks available. We don't even charge for it if that's a requirement, because really the landed cost now is 50 cents a mask. It's just nothing compared to what that exposure can be if someone brings that in. And so when an outside carrier, a vendor, a public official comes on property, and it's reduced, but before they get through the gates or enter the door, they're required to produce a mask, or we will provide one. Otherwise, it's just a failure to start. Because we can't compromise on health. So again, a lot of different things we have done, but we've had only one case out of 600 total employees, and 458 of them were consistently operating throughout this event. We've had only one confirmed case, and we've had plenty of folks we put on quarantine, right, out of self-quarantine, if you will, or I would call it HR quarantine. And they were paid or compensated for that time and leave as part of California's business requirements or regulation that the governor stated. But with only that one event, we had 0 additional quarantine effects or primary concerns. So we've had one confirmed, 0 additional cases, 0 spread. And we all have seen what's happened in manufacturing. Yes, they're a little bit closer, but during breaks, during startups, during everything, our people are close, they're interacting, they're on the docks, they're in, it's not touchless, it's not without that integration. So our tactics work, and you have to be unwavering. Lisa, you looked at your
Frank, we do have a question or two related to this. One is that somebody was asking, you have some jobs listed as available on your website, like a facilities manager. So are those still available, or is that?
Yes, we are back to because of the the segmentation of the business and kind of how we changed some of that prioritization and brought other business on during this time and restructured where the gaps were. We are back to 100% of volume, and we've had all of our associates come back. We had just in operations alone, I want to give exact numbers, but we had, nearing 100 associates that had to be furloughed due to the decline in business at the time, and a great number else that had significantly reduced hours. But everybody collaborated and worked together, and that understood it wasn't controllable. It was a necessity, and very well communicated. So everybody came back, but one person. And so we are now hiring to get out ahead of the continuous return we hope for, right?
Well, that's interesting. So you're saying that you proactively looked for business opportunities when COVID hit and your volume went down dramatically, at least on that side of the business. And some of those have turned out to be successful, it sounds like.
And there were others that were in the works that were escalated. What we would have said, look, that's a chain business. Really the right timing is this. We called up and said, hey, do you want to start early? We worked with the customers. I'm understanding they have obligations or commitments, but what we had to expand for, we were planning for some expansion of the building and changing in the layout, a significant one, $11 million, right? So a big change in the layout of the building to allow for us to have more capacity for this new business. When we looked at the timeline and them coming on towards the end of the year, we went, well, let's reach out. It's always worth an ask. And since business is down, we can change the prioritization of that expansion. We don't need it currently because we have capacity and we have gap, right? So let's fill that gap first. And it worked out, right? They were ready, they were willing, they wanted to work with us, and they came on board early. So that was piece two.
That's great. That's great. Well, and you might address it, but there was a question too about, find it here, but basically about whether you made any strategic changes that you had to implement due to COVID-19, or do you think they were all tactical?
Strategic in that we should stick to what we do best. And, you know, one strategy we had, and we have quarterly strategic goal setting meetings at more of the senior management level. We come together as a group, and it's offsite somewhere private where we can kind of talk about our strategy. And we do have some outside consultants there too, because even though we're good at what we do, we understand that additional minds or styles of thought are great and necessary. And so we've gotten to the point where our strategy is, look, there's a huge market for what we do, and trying to be everything for everybody or trying to adapt too fast, you're missing out on the fundamental core. And so part of our strategy was, right, let's become the best provider, the biggest at what we do best. And before we try to get into e-commerce or other, evolving pieces, those are great. And in some effect, that is still happening because you can't be too late to enter the game, right? You always have to be prepping and tooling that, and you don't want to be last.
For sure, e-commerce has grown, but that's interesting. So what I hear you saying, and tell me if this is right, but what I hear you saying is that you stuck to your core you stuck to your core, which was part of your strategy, and you expanded your customer base within that core.
Well, really and yes and no, because we stuck to what we do in terms of we really do well is, quality, safe, transport and distribution in food service supply chain. But we'd stopped looking at the restaurant chain as what we do, where in past we had maybe stepped over opportunities or just didn't go down that road of additional, there's additional opportunity or business we should explore, because in past we found it just wasn't what we do best. Now we're working with grocery chains. We're working to see if our private fleet can become even more than normal, which we already do quite a bit of, but can it become out there on the spot market available to keep our drivers busy and to cover some fix? What else can we do now at a wider scope, right? Because the scope has changed because our market has shrunken, right? So, and that's the strategy, right? Let's change our scope. Right, was a strategy, right, to continue to be useful and viable long term.
Yep, makes sense. Okay, that sounds good. So I don't want to distract you too long. So keep going, and I have other questions, but let's
all right.
We'll let you keep going.
There's only 10 slides, and I'm on 6 here, but I can go down bunny holes all day. I love it.
Yeah, so, I know.
So
we'll try to keep you going.
Yeah, please keep me on task, right? So. We were talking about health and safety, and I think we really kind of nailed that in, but we've never stopped. I according to the bleach, and I forgot to mention the reason I really wanted the bleach is sometimes the biggest risk we have out there is fear or panic or perceived lack of communication with our associates and our team members. And so they have to see we're practicing what we preach, but we're doing everything we can. And sometimes that's maybe sensory, right? Or that may be a perception that it needs to be done all this time when it's really not necessary, but we're going to do it anyways for visibility so they can see we're doing everything we can, and we'll take it a level above if that makes people feel safe and comfortable. So 10-to-1 bleach was chosen by myself versus neutral or lemon scented sanitizers, right? Because those smell pretty nice, but I want them to know it's safe and sanitized. So it smells like a swimming pool in our offices and in parts of our areas. Not overwhelming, but I do want that sense of, hey, it smells like this place has been sanitized, right? And then when that's lacking, I can go, sounds like, oh, there they come, right? Our trucks, everything we do, right? This has been sanitized. This has been sanitized. This has been touched. It's about that visibility. So again, I don't want to belabor this point, but just continuing. And now I'm working with a sanitation service to have a rapid response team. So if anybody's of concern, They'll be here. We can talk to our associates. We're already doing this, but now it's canned, right? They'll be here in a certain amount of time. It'll be sanitized in a certain amount of time. And we're willing to pay additional to make certain that you understand our priorities are safety first and foremost, right? Because it's the right thing to do, but it's also, you have to create and instill that sense of comfort, right? So it's tactical, but it's also the right thing to do. So it's a win-win. Tech. When we started going down to grocery distribution, and then we went to other forms of distribution and cross-docking and all kinds of different means to sustain and utilize assets, and so, over that fixed capital burden, we found that we use a lot of technology here. At least we talked about that. We heavily engage in technology because, again, in a competing cost framework, or in that as a realization of the industry, right? You have to keep your costs as low as possible. Labor is rising, cost of living is rising, right? Equipment, everything's rising, but the only thing you can really sacrifice is quality or cost. We work to constantly utilize our technology. Well, our technology has gotten so great that it has just helped us with a ton of learnings. However, is it flexible? And we found not as much as it needed to be. So a lot of things had to be done either through a workaround or a complete absence of. And so that's a realization that what we can or can't do, depending on what the need is, may be limited by our tech. We need to communicate that up front, because that's why in the past we didn't do what we weren't best at, right? And now if we're gonna vary from that, we have to understand where those limitations are, because the cost or the outcome could be an even significantly greater burden when we're trying to be nimble and be viable to sustain. So in that, then understanding what our assets were, everybody should know, I hope you know what your asset base is, but what are their capabilities? How many do you have? How many are unutilized? Can you rent them? Pallet jacks and forklifts, grocery needed them. A number of different supply chain groups were needing them significantly, to the point where I'm talking to folks in my vendor community, and they're going, yeah, I just can't keep rentals. I'm out of rentals. I have 50% of my fleet sitting here. How about I sublease them to you, because I can't take another piece here, the risk on liability that it comes along with that. My equipment's in great shape, but you can manage through that. I'm just going to sublet it to you, Mr. Vendor, and you're going to, afford me what you think is fair for your portion of the risk, right? But it's thinking outside the box and using that assets and that equipment, but using it in a manner that, one, is fiscally, responsible, is risk mitigated, is ethical, right? Because you're not wanting to send stuff out that shouldn't be. We don't just keep it like that, right? Anyways, but again, utilizing that asset, you also have to be ready, just like with our associates, for the business to suddenly change, right? So if you're massively selling off, or you've got it now rented to somebody who's not willing to give it back, or is committed to a certain time period, and the business changes, all of a sudden now you've got a constraining variable that you don't want to have in this environment, right? When it comes back, you need to be ready to go right back, because market share is going to be grabbed in huge quantities by those who have the capacity. That's now a strategy, right? Is our ability to provide service in a perceived serviceless environment.
So basically you're thinking proactively about how to keep enough capacity available or flexible so that you can expand quickly, is what you're saying, right?
Well, we understand, and this is what grocery perceived, right? Again, I hate to speak this, but I love the analogy, where's my toilet paper? Well, there was plenty of toilet paper being made, and the manufacturers told you, we will not run out of toilet paper, or people were fearing that and hoarding it. What you had was a gap in the supply chain, because you overwhelmed the on-hand, the safety stock. You overwhelmed the traditional buffer, right, to overcome all those steps in the supply chain that we all are quite well versed in understanding, right, from outside carrier transit time to manufacturing to sub-warehousing to distribution, receipt, redistribution. All of those were quickly taxed and depleted, and there's a gap before that can be refilled. It wasn't a gap in production. We make enough production of toilet paper to sustain and exceed our needs, and we can adjust that where needed, but it was trapped in other places too. So I realized and tried to reach out to some folks, but they'd already gotten there. There's Cintas, I called them, and I said, hey, I know this is what you do best, and I know you had a huge supply of it. So what happens to all those office departments and all those other places where that have toilet paper that's in a dark building that's shut down?
Yep.
Right? Where can we access that? So I don't know if that answers the question. I kind of got down a bunny hole mentally there, but that's some of the steps we take, right, in managing those assets, and that's applied.
Well, and it kind of relates to this other question that came up. So I guess I'll ask this now as well. Is like, as the situation's fluid and the changes in the food market happen suddenly, how do you manage your forecast and inventory control? I mean, what you're talking about relates to that. So I may as well, just.
It does. So I think they do relate into this because your supply and your base changes, right? So yeah, we're taking our supply and redirecting it because others need it viably and we can't get rid of it fast enough. We're carrying all this inventory now that we've paid for. We continue to pay for everything we ordered in full, even though our customers are not. Some of them are not paying us, right? They're extending their credit lines or just aren't calling back because they just don't, we understand they don't have the means. Now we have some requirements and obligations to that. And again, through that culture, right, we found we're now back to 90% currency with our customer base and restaurants, right, which is awesome. But what we knew, and okay, yeah, and so here's the plan, right? What do we do to manage that supply chain? And also, what are we looking at for that quick return? Well, we know the business will return because people always have to eat. We're an essential provider in food service supply chain. The supply chain as a whole was granted, right, variants to the common restrictions because we're essential in what we do. People finally realized the value of those big trucks out on the road and the folks that are working and making the noise at night when they realize that it can run out that quickly. So to tie in to the previous question and the forward question, we had to keep our equipment, our people ready to go because once things relieved, we knew people were going to get out there and wanting to get out there, right? Cabin fever was going to mean, let's rush back out. We're seeing that now, right? And it's almost too much to where we're having to backpedal a little bit. But when that happened, much needed capital influx as also our customers who needed to, stay afloat, were hanging on by a thread. We needed to be ready and nimble right away because the need would come back unexpectedly. The federal government and the local government didn't do a great job of giving timelines. There was intangibles that suddenly changed all the time. We expected that. So we had to be ready at a moment's notice. So that's why we expected to come back. And so the great question, what do you do with your supply and your inventory? You have to do whatever you can to shed the perishable, right? Because everything has an expiring timeline. Paper goods, low value, those types of products you can sit on, right? It stinks because your capital's tied up, and that affects your operating capabilities in a tight capital. But there's things you're just going to lose. So a lot of fresh items like different meats and dairy had to go in the freezer, and we just had to freeze stuff because the crazy thing is, one, you don't want the cost of shrink, which our operating costs quadrupled on shrink, and in some areas of the business outside of what we did here, I saw it even maybe double that, so 8x, right? And so it's just a huge, and again, you got to overcome that fixed. And what do you do with a perishable asset, right? You have to find as many outlets you can. Go to grocery. That was strategic to keep our equipment and our business rolling, but it also was a great outlet for that perishable. That's where we went to them first, and then over time, as they were starting to try and resupply, it also helped with some of the other short lead time items because the scare items like toilet paper were out fast, but the other items that have short shelf life have short reserve and buffer. And so they needed those outlets quickly, and we had that supply. So anything we could do. And then at the end of the day, can we find someone to give this to? Because it's our requirement as a good partner to our industry and to our community that if people are hungry, people need to eat, and there's a scarce resource, and we have excess of it, at the end of the day, can we help our associates? Can we help the community with this asset rather than just throw in the dumpster? And we had a lot of that did happen, regretfully, because a lot of folks were producing for the need because of the high rate of loss across the board. But even there, our rules and regulation, so going down to a further point, allowed us to only sell to industrial or commercial, right? We could not sell to public. So we could not go retail. We couldn't sell. We have a will call, but it's for customers. We have the right tax ID, right, and credit statement. So we cannot sell to the outside consumer. We're not packaged for that. We're not licensed for that. We cannot repack due to health code, and we don't waiver in that because that little well, it's kind of a gray area, or that no one's really watching that. It may not be a problem now, but at some point in time it could come back, and it's just not how we want to operate. But we can have associate benefit utilizing that. That is allowed, and so associates were able to feed their immediate family when resources were close, and there was no margin on that. In fact, then when you added in the ability to exercise that and the huge demand, we suddenly realized there was a loss on that. But again, it was an outlet. It covered some of the cost. Excuse me, some seasonal allergies. It's not COVID, but yeah, and it also was the right thing to do for our associates, right? Which helped us long term as well. So does that answer your question? I hope.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. My apologies here. So I'm just gonna. They don't want to be that guy. Okay, there we go. Sorry, team. Let's go on here. I'm gonna move quickly because I see time is expiring, and I know you all have valuable time here. So I want to move through kind of some of the topics. I'll just try and be less elaborative. So capital, again, human capital, what's our ability there and what's our necessity? What do we need to be nimble and to be ready in a moment's notice? But could it also be a limitation of what we can do? And that's through training.
Frank, are you still on that slide, flexibility in a rigid framework?
Yeah, did you lose it?
You what?
You can't see it?
Flexibility in a rigid framework, I can see, yes.
Yes, yeah, just closing these out quick here.
Okay, no problem. I just want to make sure I was on the right one here.
Yes, thank you. So again, that human and financial capital, I'm moving on the bunny hole, but a lot of change was needed there, but was also a limiting factor. Again, when you're not getting paid, how can you continue to be the culture you want to be? And what can you do with what remains? So capital expenditures were reduced. I think everybody went through that, but we didn't need it at the time. You got to manage your risk. You got to make sure you're within your regulation. We technically are licensed and could haul items like cigarettes and alcohol, but we never reached out to that because there's some risk in that, and we just didn't want to go down that road. There's other ways or avenues. That's kind of a last resort, but there was some availability. And then your organizational adaptability. Do you have silos? Are you a traditional step-up management structure? Here we're a hybrid management, a matrix, what you would call. So we have traditional hierarchy, but then we have a lot of dotted lines and untraditional report-ins, and that allows for the organization. It's just a preference, right, or a different op model that's become more accepted in recent years, and it took took a little time to adjust, but now I really love it because it allows you to be nimble and reactive, right? Because that's what you need to be right now. The traditional hierarchy has bottlenecks, funnels, and choke points that can affect your ability to adapt in that quick changing environment. So I have the ability to make a certain amount of decisions on my own, on the fly, as I see right, ethical, and prudent. And if it gets too big, right, we have some notification, and then there's also some restriction, right, within necessity or reasonability, but it helps us. So when we talk about limitations, just a couple points, and now I can't be too elaborate, but drive through everything, right? So it started, our drive through food business went great, but now I'm, at CVS and Walgreens, I'm seeing they now offer pretty much anything out their drive through window. And now you're having businesses you call ahead and they leave it on the curb for you, right? So it's drive up or drive through has become a huge changing need. And so what we have there then is a need in our business to change, right? We had to go back. No, styrofoam became suddenly acceptable, and plastics and individual serve, where that was once an initiative and we were in compliance with. Now it's like, just get what you can because the needs are changing out there. And so are the other businesses around us. And if they're not changing, they're in a huge problem. And that's why I say death to retail. Retail's been struggling for some time, but online now is become a necessity, and folks that weren't always getting comfortable with it are now becoming very familiar with it. And I think that's going to be an outcome because of that rigidity in their framework. I don't know if they don't have a huge online segment and a get out plan on their structure, if they'll be viable. All right. So change is constant. Stop me anytime. I'm going to move along here a little bit though. So we talked about change, right? And how do we adapt to it? That's a key here, right? Change management. It became a fundamental and a tactic, right? So where it was always kind of a fundamental of business and good leadership, it now becomes a tactic because we need our ability to adapt and be flexible to acquire a finite resource, right, out there, right? So what freight is available, what avenues are available to utilize our asset base to keep from going under, right? As we've seen, is now a tactical ability, right? So how flexible can we be? And as we talked there, right, it's a principle, but it's changing rapidly as the tactic. So is that a long-term adaptation or a short-term change? So the short-term changes were kind of like you've seen out there when one of our customers, The Habit, is doing a great job with that. So The Habit now didn't have drive-through set up, but they have, that wasn't the primary setup of the restaurants. Over 90% were fast serve counter. So they put out tents out in their yards, right, pop-ups, and they've got iPads for their associates, and they basically more or less created a drive-up drive-through, right, using lines in their parking lot. So, that's a short-term change, right? Or is it? Because as we're too realizing, right, there's some other avenues out there, and hey, maybe the strategic, thought process becomes more of a business continuity need, right, in this environment that's constantly changing. We have to look at long-term adaptation as an ability to stay solid in this ever-changing world. And so there's short-term needs, there's long-term needs. Long-terms take a different approach, but short-term may require you to skip some steps and just be communicative. So talk about successful change management. I'm not going to go too much into this because the people that are on here, I think if you're engaging in this type of resource or collaboration and learning, you probably understand the basics of change management. So for the sake of time, I'll skip. But I want to just touch on it as it pertains to the change in need, right? The nimble, right? So you still have to know what your objective is. You still have to know who it affects. But in past, I always believe the best buy-in was received from collaboration. Well, now I have to make a quick decision. That's my responsibility, and I have to do it in a time frame dictated by the environment. So I may have to change the collaboration piece to post-collaborative, and let's talk about what's working, what's not, and we can retool. But right now, this is what we have to do, right? And just talking to folks about that, they understand, right? Because they get the environment's changing. So your process has to be nimble too, right? You have to adapt and be flexible, even in the basic process and approach. Figure out that solution comes right after shareholders, and get out and communicate if you're going to skip the other step. But be effective, be transparent in your communication of, here's what we normally do, here's why we're doing this, here's what we believe could be the effect of the shareholders, just straight up to our teams. We're having to put some people on furlough, but realistically, we have to put more if we don't put out the basic premise that you're probably all going to get 31 hours a week, right? We're going to pay your benefits regardless, even if you get 26. And everybody we furloughed, we paid their full healthcare costs with no questions asked while we had them out on furlough. So I think that helps, right? But we're gonna maintain that requirement and obligation because it's the right thing to do. But you're all going to get a little bit less, so that more of you have that ability. Than if we just want everybody to get 40, then we've got to put more people out, right? And that's transparency that was required to keep that buy-in and that collaboration and bring everybody back, right? Because they trust we're trying to do the right things when we're not bringing their input or giving time for their input. And then implementation, reinforcement, and reevaluation is always a constant, but reinforcement on things like the health initiative. So the masks, the sanitation. It was quick after a couple of weeks, especially when the requirements by the states and feds changed, for people to want to revert or slack or relax off. And we have to constantly re-energize the understanding of why we're doing this, what the importance is, what we've learned and what we're seeing as our effect and their safety, and just constantly reinforce, look, we don't want to go to a different tactic, but we will if we have to. This is mandatory. We all are in this together. You have to do it, right? So reinforcement is in this level of change is required because people go back to what's comfortable. So we got 2 slides left, and really this is the meat left here. So Retail and tablecloths, surviving in that environment. So I say retail and tablecloths are history, right? People aren't going to dine in as much. They're going to be afraid to, even when it does come back, because they now have a better understanding of really what health risks are viable. And some other places where they went to a buffet, they're going to be like, some of this is going to change permanently. We all believe that in the food service industry. And so, we want to talk about changes we experienced, right? And we want to reflect on what worked and what didn't, and what do we need to prepare for the next round of change, because the constant we're certain of is that there will be another round, and there likely could be another round of that, where we go back to shelter in place, where we go back to even maybe new restrictions because the officials are learning, right? So what did we learn on health and safety, but also what did we learn with an organization that is an obstacle that we need to work on during this normal operating mode or somewhat normal operating mode, so that we can continue to be nimble and flexible, right, remove obstacles and barriers. And that requires cross-training. That requires your staff to be able to do multiple hats, because when you narrow, you need people to take on more, just less of it, but there's more obligation. How do we share our resources with other divisions and other departments to reduce impact on pooled resources? And centralization, obviously that's a big initiative out there anyways, but can we do more? As we work from home, we realized, hey, a number of this could be centralized, or people can stay working from home where we once thought it couldn't, because when you're forced to do something, you really, you have to do it. You learn where the pressure points are, and sometimes you go, not what I thought, right? A totally different outcome than I thought, right? And it just reinforces to me, I was lots of moments I was wrong, on what my traditional thought would have told me or my experience. And I went, okay, good to know, right? I'm gonna keep that, because I always love to say, don't be a victim of your circumstances, right? Let's talk about solutions. How are we gonna overcome the obstacle? Because in absence of that, you're just continuously communicating your problems or your effect. And to me, I don't mean that to be a negative connotation, because there are people who are victims of things they can't control, and that's not what this meant. But I don't want you to be a victim of your circumstances. If something is an obstacle that there's a potential to overcome, let's explore it and let's move past it, right? We need to talk about what can we do, not what can't we do. And so that kind of goes along with this, and how do we retool and find different ways. What goes down must come up. Hopefully will come up. It used to be what goes up must come down. Well, we already wrote that one, but we have to be ready for what comes up. And that was the question we discussed, Lisa, is we have to constantly be ready for change downward. And how do we shed, costs responsibly and effectively where we can? Because what we did during this environment to share resources, to outsource, to change tactics, to adjust employee levels, we found actually, and this is just a good structure and process. This is, if you understand your operating principles, and you're constantly evaluating and calculating that daily, it shouldn't be a surprise, but I was a little bit surprised to how much we stayed and overcame. So we use the cost per case, but for sake of ease, the point here being all the things we did and we talked about, we expected it to see at the worst points about a 40% increase in costs, possibly more.
Really?
Because of the fixed asset base, right? The buildings, the equipment, the huge dollars. We buy new equipment, we don't lease, we change it out every 5 years. So some of those pieces, right, the technology, huge cost. Carrying associate employee benefit, healthcare with no working hours against it, right? That was a burden cost that we needed, we must do. And they didn't waver or question that. But so yeah, 40% was geez, but some folks did 50 or more. That lasted for about 2 weeks because we just needed to tool down faster. It was happening faster than we could tool it down. But because we knew how to calculate what we should have and continue to react, we were able to get to basically at the regular point of normal when it was down, within 10% of normal operating costs. And then towards the end, as business slowly changed, we're actually achieving now that would be about 15% better than pre-COVID operating costs, running the business as normal, but from lessons learned. And again, that realization from not only our staff maybe who were questioning, but our associates, that's not possible, is no longer an obstacle, because they realize anything's possible when you have to, right? And so, we're open-minded, and that's helping us achieve better. So it's a great positive.
Very good.
And what the rest I'll just skip. You can read that, right? Support industry.
Yeah. We're definitely going to send out the presentation. I guess with that said, though, Frank, is there any summarizing point that you would want to? There we go.
That's it. The summation is, we don't know what's next, right? The road looks straight for now, but there's a curve upcoming. We're almost certain of that. And so what did we learn currently? We have to never stop growing. We have to change our physical limitations. We have to be flexible, nimble, stick to your culture, stick to your core, your core values, but don't get overstuck in specialization or what we should or can't do, because anything's possible when you talk about evolving to a changing environment, right? Nature will evolve, and that's generally acceptable now. But nature will evolve, right? And the species that adapt, right, survive, right? And those that don't adapt to the changing environment may have a less desirable fate. And I equate that into my business, right? And so the point here is stay flexible, stay nimble, and evolve with the changing environment or business environment. And thank your people. That's the last piece, because at the end of the day, if you don't have their buy-in, their support, and their commitment, you can't run a good business without good people.
Yeah, exactly. And I assume the last question I'll ask you, I know you have significant technology that we saw on the tour. Like, a lot of it relates to really being efficient in the warehouse, as well as in your delivery network. I assume that since you were already ahead of the curve, really, in terms of having a lot of good technology, I'm assuming that was came in handy as this crisis came about, because you could certainly I don't know, you'd leverage
you can
that
account
technology
and track everything, right? When we're doing something we didn't know, we could see how it affects the process. It was, but as mentioned, there were instances where we realized, we specialized our technology so much that it's great, but we needed to bypass, or we need to create a loop that goes around that, but still affords. We believe in sticking to that technology as traceability and cost management. But when we get in these intangibles, what we're learning is, how do we turn that off and still have a viable system?
Well, actually, that's a really good point, and that's true in manufacturing as well. Like, if you have too much automated, it doesn't know what to do.
Exactly.
Change. So that is a challenge. So that's a good point. So it's a bit of a mix.
And we have an automated facility in Arizona. There's only a couple distributors that have fully automated food distribution. We're building another 1.1 million square foot automated facility in Colorado. And that requires a certain amount of feed to be viable, because it has upper and lower limits. So if you're not evaluating how do we take out some of those constraints or retool, when you're supplying grocery, it's different, right? When you're supplying another supplier. So that automation can also be constraining if your environment has to change, and it's a huge capital burden to overcome then too, right?
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you. This has been a great webinar. You've provided us with lots of good information, and it's certainly been a wild ride in warehousing and distribution. And it really depends, like you said, who are your customers, and who are you supporting, and how agile are you? So that's great. It was really good to get that perspective in our webinar series. So thank you very much for doing that. And for those of you that are joining us, we're posting we had several really great speakers in our Navigating Through Volatility webinar series, including certainly Frank today. We had ports, we had a manufacturing panel, we had all sorts of really good webinars, and they're going to be posted online. And we're also starting online classes. CSCP will be starting at the end of July or the beginning of August. We're going to be sending that announcement out shortly. We'll be doing that virtually. We're also going to be scheduling a CPIM class that's virtual, and if things open up, we might just convert it into a little bit of a hybrid approach to take the best of both. So, and in the fall, we'll look at CLTD as well. So we would love to have you join us for our classes. I think that what Frank's been talking about today just leads it to the more fundamentals and background in education you have, the more successful you're going to be, so that you can be nimble and respond to these changing conditions. So, but thank you again, Frank, for everything. And
thank you for the opportunity. And I agree. None of us are smarter than all of us, right?
that's right. That's exactly right. We have to work together. So thank you, and have a great rest of the day.